and understanding them, and you can disagree with them and you can agree with them, but at least you must understand how they originated, how they came about, and what are the implications of using one or the other. Now, let me say that first of all, I start off with the fact that, you know, economists disagree. Why do I say that? I want to make that very clear because usually economics, and certainly economic policy, is sometimes put forward as a kind of a truth. This is the way to go forward. And this is the solution. This is the problem, and this is how we go forward. Let me say, you have in the South African recent policies, they have said, okay, there's a lot of unemployment, therefore you must make sure that your education is such that you increase employability. Right? Have you all heard about this? Yes. You must increase employability. So there is an idea that, you know, when a government gives a certain position, that there is a certain degree of truth in it. And what I would like to bring out a little bit more is that actually this truth is highly contested. Now, I'll give you an example. Let's take unemployment. I want to, if you put three economists together of different types, they will say, why is unemployment there? Now, Liz told you yesterday, from a certain perspective, unemployment is there as a reserve army of labor. Remember? You don't remember, Liz? Huh? There was this reserve. Sorry, did I use the correct word? Reserve army of labor. But anyway, in order to make sure that wages don't go up, if you ask the increase in wages, we'll take some of the other people. If you ask another person, economists will say, like you said, employability. You don't have sufficient skills. Yet another person will say, hey, you're unemployed because your wages are too high. You bring your wages down, we can't employ you, you bring your wages down. So all I want you to say is that a single problem is seen from different perspectives with different ideas of why they came about, as well as what is the solution to them. And what I would like to do today is to expose you to some of the main types of perspectives and to look in terms of what are the implications that they hold in terms of, I've used the term distribution of power and material resources, but let's say politics. And with a little bit of focus on labor and gender issues as well. Let me start out with a simple thing. What is economics? Okay, let's see. You can't just say money, something about money, surely. Okay? It is about money, of course, but what about money? Okay, money. Anything else? Have you considered economics with power? What definition of economics is power?
Power to purchase, the power to develop.
Okay, purchasing.
Power to influence how other things should be done.
That is an implication of it. But what is the economics all about?
Transaction of resources between the various people.
How we
value things.
Yeah.
Demand and supply.
Demand and supply. Okay, I will come back to this. But you're right when it says that in a very fundamental sense, economics is all about valuation. What do I mean by that? It can be at a simple level as saying, the value of this is $5, the value of this is $10. So it's that simple. There's a certain process of valuation. But it could be also a little bit more than that. It is actually making a kind of a evaluation of what this is. In other words, it's kind of making an evaluation or a judgment, let me put it, about the value of certain activities. In the most core aspect, what economics is, the whole area of whether it's demand and supply, whether this is $10 or whatever it is trying to provide a certain judgment about the worth of a certain activity. How much is this worth? You're, as a teacher, you're worth $1,000. You as a student, you're worth so much. You as a carpenter, you're worth. So there is a certain judgment involved. And that is what economics is all about. And what you obviously see in that process, it has to do with the principles of valuation. How do you define value? What causes value? What is the source of value? What is the relationship between different activities? Why is this valued higher than this? Yesterday we had a discussion, but I'll come back to that. No. And what is the best way to go forward? You know, in the message that I gave you about the South African policy, we say we go forward by doing this, by making labor more employable, which has certain assumptions on how to create value. Now, if we go a little further behind this, what you do see is that there have been different theories which have dealt with this notion of valuation. And again, taking help from Liz's discussions yesterday, I thought, okay, let me try and give you a little bit of the history of how economic theorization developed as we see now. Okay? And so just look at this as a story. Nothing more than a story. And it's always nice to hear stories which have, you can take it for what you want. Now, if you want to look at how economic theorization did take place, you have to look at, do you have, I would like you to go to this slide that you have got, which has got the historical development of economic theory, which is, I think, there. Oh, good. Now, in a very historical sense, the first type of economic theorization, if you want to say, started off round about the 17th century, and it was associated with a particular school called mercantilism. Now, look at what was happening there. At that time, it was a so-called, what do they call it, age of discovery, where you had ships going from let's say, the Western European powers, going to India, to wherever, buying spices, bringing them back. So this was the so-called merchants, the buying and selling. Mercantilism, therefore, was a theorization about this process. Okay, because that was what was happening at that time. Ships were going out, colonialism was taking place, and basically what you saw were people going to, let's say, the more tropical regions, buying spices, buying other things, bringing them back and selling them in the local market. So, from their point of view, and mercantilism reflected the kind of dominance, the merchants were the most important people of that period. And therefore, can you tell me from their concept, how was value being created? Don't remember? What we talk about, let's say wealth, forget the term value. How was wealth being created? Yes?
Out of wants and needs, through the trading.
To the trading, yeah, but what did you say?
Through wants and needs.
Through wants and needs, but wants and needs means, how do you relate it to the trading? Look, what is happening? You're going there, you're buying things, and you're bringing them back. You're buying cheap and selling dear. That is one of the yes.
So at some point, supplying was being demanded in other areas.
Now, don't use terminologies which you're not going to be in. Just say what is actually what within that framework. Wealth is being generated in the process of exchange. Okay? So what are they doing? In mercantilism, the whole philosophy was, hey, sell it, buy cheap, sell dear. So the value or wealth, let's just use the term wealth. Wealth was created in the process of exchange. Is that clear?
Yes.
Good. Keep it because it comes back later. Now you have, so the merchants are very powerful. And what happened was that by the 18th century, they were so powerful, and particularly the French courts, that they started buying up a lot of political power as well. And countering them, therefore there were a group of people that came up to say, hey, you know, they were against the power of the merchants. They were buying up places, they're buying up seats, they're buying up all kinds of things in the French kingdom at that stage. And so there came up another group of people called the physiocrats. Now, what did the physiocrats say? They said, hey, this is not the way actually wealth is being created. Wealth is being created in a different way. Now, as the term would suggest, physiocrats said, no, wealth is actually being created in production, not in exchange. Okay? They had a sort of input-output table, which they showed that the wealth in a particular place was being created through production, not exchange. And not only that, they said it was labor in production. They were able to show, don't forget, they were countering the power also of the merchants. And they said, no, if we count and we see where all the things come, you can actually show that wealth is being generated not in exchange, but actually in production and through labor in production. Now, at that time, there was basically agricultural labor. Okay? The large amount of agricultural labor. And therefore, the source of wealth was agricultural labor in production. So can you see a contrast between the mercantilists and the physiocrats? Right, at the next stage, and I'm jumping several steps, the next big stop you might say was Adam Smith. Adam Smith is sometimes called the father of political economy or father of many things, but in any case, what he wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations. And this book actually tried to, amongst other things, look at what actually created wealth. And he took up really the physiocrats' notion at one level. Because he said, yes, wealth is created by labor in production, but he was living during a period when there was the Industrial Revolution. Okay? So he said it was labor in agriculture and industrial production. So the value was generated by labor in agriculture and industrial production. So can you see the build-up? Exchange, agriculture in production, labor in agricultural production, and then labor in agriculture and industrial production. Now, Adam Smith, in his work, had actually two notions of value, and I'm using value and wealth at the moment a little bit the same. Okay, I'll go into the details later. Now, he used two kinds of values. One was what he called the labor embodied notion of value, which is what I told you just now. Okay, that value, the only source of value was labor. He had another notion of value which said it was a labor commanded notion of value. Basically, what that notion of value said was labor is a source of value, but it is not the only source of value. He used these two in the same book. Now, one group of people, one group of economists, if I might use the term, they were all called political economists, if I do. I don't think they were ever called economists at that period, took up and carried over that notion. And if you look at this graph, there was a line which took over the labor embodied notion of value, which is that labor is the only source of value. It was followed by Keynes and Marx, and I'll go into this. Okay, so the line from physiocrats, sometimes it's called the classical political economy, took over and carried over the notion that labor is the only source of value. All right? There was another group that took over the labor commanded notion of value and said, yes, labor is a source of value, but there are other sources of value. Your land is a source of value, capital is a source of value, there are other sources of value as well. So they were basically that group, and that's a very important group, so I'm not going into it now in detail, but I will go into it in detail. That took off, so you can find a kind of a break into roughly three. The Ricardian line, which more or less accepted that labor was the only source of value. You could roughly see them split into two, which is I've called for the sake of ease the Keynesian, but you might call I call it Keynesian, let's put it like that, and the sort of Marxist. Now, I have just shown you this, and I'm going into some more detail on this, to make you understand that first of all, these notions of value also reflect what groups and people are trying to understand in terms of what is happening. These are historically developed, and they change over time, but there also are contestations taking place. So far, okay? Any questions on this quick sweep? All right. Keep in mind, in the mercantilists, exchange is a source of value. You have physiocrats, labor in production is a source of value. Adam Smith, labor and agriculture is a source of production. Two lines into the Ricardian and the Malthus. The Malthus went into the exchange notion, which I will come into. And then you have the Marxists and the Keynesians. Yes?
What is happening before mercantilism? Was it just not sort of named?
No, there was, of course, feudalism taking place. There wasn't, let's say, in a way, what I'm talking about is with the rise of the market, as we know. You had feudalism, you had other kinds of modes of production taking place, where production didn't go through really the market, but in the feudal structure, it was exchange of goods between maybe the landlord and the serf. Okay. Okay, let's go a little further. I must see the time. No? So, and keep in mind that all these different groups have different positions which are important. Now, what I would like to do is actually do a little bit more into these three main schools. Because you're going to have to deal with them when you want to even analyze today. And like Liz mentioned, it's very important for you to get different perspectives. And you can choose. But understand the different perspectives, understand what are the assumptions understand the implications that they hold for society, for the distribution of resources, and then you can decide, listen, I prefer this or this or the other. But please understand that these are all, in a way, different discourses that you need to take into account. Now, let me start off, I'm trying to think which is the best one to start off with, to be honest. Which ones are you most familiar with? Are you all familiar with a Marxist? Are you familiar with...
It's two different things.
Huh?
The one thing is that people think that they are familiar with the Marx.
No, I'm just talking because there's been a history of it in the country. At least there must be. How many of you are familiar with the neoclassical? Probably less. Let me start off by the neoclassical then. And then I go into the Marxists and the Keynesians. Okay? Can you see me here? If I write here?
Yes.
And I'm going to do this without any algebra, but I want your... Is it easy if I do it this side? Or it doesn't matter? And I'm going to do it without algebra, but I want you to tell me when you don't understand. Within the neoclassical school, the most important unit of analysis is the individual. Okay? So you have the individual, and every individual has got what they call tastes and talents. What are tastes? Tastes reflect what you might call your preferences. You know, I might prefer rice, you might prefer bread. My taste is to go to the movies, your taste is to sleep at home, doesn't matter, but it reflects your taste in terms, that's what they call your preferences. Talents reflect your skills, which are used in productive activity to satisfy your preferences. So, keep this in mind. Huh? So, what does a person do? A person uses her or his capacity, her skills to satisfy your preferences. Alright. Now, society is made up of a number of these individuals.
So let's try and give you a pointer, but I can't find another.
Oh, that's a pain.
All right,
No.
we give up. I tried.
Thank you. Can you see my scribbles here? Okay. Now, don't forget, within the neoclassical society, society is made up of a number of these individuals. Okay? Each of them trying to satisfy their preferences through productive activity. Because of that, now we have a division of labor in society. So, for example, I have a skill to be a carpenter, but you have a skill to be a teacher, and she has a skill to be a cook, and he has a skill to be a president. Well, no, I shouldn't say that, general, whatever it is. Yeah. That's a bad, always bad. You have different, so in society you have different skills, which means that while you are doing your skills, you also have to, buy some other goods which are necessary for your life. In other words, in society, every individual is both a producer and a consumer. Okay, I work 8 hours on producing my cakes, but because of that I have to buy my pen and my house and my things on. So every individual in society is both a producer and a consumer. Okay? Now, all these producers and consumers have to come and exchange their goods and services. Right? So, all the goods and producers come and exchange their goods and services in the market, in the money market. And how do they exchange their goods and services? They exchange them, but they exchange them at certain prices or values. Right? Now, the idea is, how are these prices formed? So far, so good? Alright, let's see how a consumer behaves. Because we're now going to see how consumers behave, how producers behave, and see what it means in terms of the market. Somebody has used a wrong pen here. Okay, now I'm a producer. I want to know how I will... No, so I'm a consumer. Now, you can ignore this, but I will just do it. If I'm a consumer and I want to buy something, for the first good of that type, I have a high utility. In other words, I have a high use value for it. Let's say I'm very thirsty. Okay? And there are 10 glasses of water in front of me. Then I have a high utility, let me put it like that, for my first glass of water, which is, I'm thirsty. So my utility is very high for my first. This is number and utility. So my first glass of water, I have a high utility. At the same point of time, I'm offered the second glass of water.
Can we use another term for utility?
No, I'm afraid this is the term that is used. So if you don't mind, I'd rather not, because all these terminologies are used within a certain paradigms of discussion. I don't want to... It just means, in a sense, what you find the use for. But the term is utility. For the time being, use it and you can explain it like I've explained it to you. It is what you feel you have a great value for at that point of time. Need. Yeah.
I need it more.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just mean that. Huh? The need for my first glass is very high. At the same point of time, I'm given a second glass of water. My need is still high because I'm thirsty. But my need is slightly less for the second glass than for the first glass. Now I'm offered the third glass of water. Okay? I do have a need for it, I do have a utility for it, but that utility is somewhat less than my utility for my second glass of water. In other words, what you have as a consumer is diminishing marginal utility for a good. I'm hungry, okay? For my first piece of bread, I have a high utility. I'm really hungry. At the same point of time, don't forget that is a very key element. At the same point of time, I'm offered the second piece of bread. My utility is high, but it's not as high as I had for my first piece of bread. And so at the margin, that's what we call marginal utility, is diminishing, is going down. So, this is translated into what you might call a demand curve. This is how the demand for a product is likely to be. Okay? And that's how consumers, which is one item in our exchange, are likely to behave. Now you have the other side, who are the producers. Right? Production. We know how the consumers work. How do the producers work? These producers are producing grain and food and pens and God knows what else. How would they behave, let's say, if prices went up?
Increase production.
Which prices are you talking
That's
about?
right.
Prices of-
Huh?
Price of production or prices that they're getting for their goods?
What would they do?
No.
Okay, we have producers who are producing goods, okay? We have seen here, this is how the consumer would behave, right? It's translated roughly into what you might call a demand curve. You have, how do consumers behave? Consumers are also looking at the market, they're also exchanging in the market, right? Producers are bringing their goods to the market, and they see that the prices are going up and down according to the demand, right? So how would, if the price were to go up, what would the producer, if you were a producer, what would you try and do? Right, you will try and bring more into the market, right? So a producer would behave a little bit like this. You bring in, this is numbers, you would try and bring in more into the market as prices increased. Now, in neoclassical economics, they say that, therefore, producers behave in this way, they will try and bring in more into the market, the demand goes in a different way, and at some point, the demand and supply will become equal at a point which is called the equilibrium price. In practice, it might go like this, It might go like this, but the idea is that ultimately they will move towards the equilibrium price. Because if you are bringing too much at a higher price, they will not. The idea is that if you have too many things at a higher price, the demand will not be there, so they will bring it down until both demand and supply match. Is this clear?
Yeah.
Now, if you want equilibrium prices to be attained, what do you need? You need all these consumers and producers to be able to come and check information and exchange their goods, isn't it? In other words, you need to have a free market. If you want to have equilibrium prices, you need to have a free market. You should not have a government coming in and interfering with that. Because then you're distorting this supply-demand mechanism. So, in this framework, basically, you have to promote the free market. If you want to get a point where there's equilibrium price, where your demand and supply are equal, match, your economy is moving well, you do need a free market. Is this, any questions on this? Okay, so there are some, I told you this, but yes?
Sorry. So does history show that when there is a free market, it's entirely self-regulated?
No. It doesn't. I'm just giving you the paradigm within which neoclassical economics puts forward these ideas. It's within the assumptions which I will just do into, they work. Now, one assumption is that there is a individual who will check all these things and carefully maximize your utility by functioning properly in the market. You also have, and it's a very important assumption, that society is made up of all individuals. Thus, no class, no special groups. Each individual has his own talents and tastes and comes. So it's all individuals. There's no groups. There's no discussion of these issues. Okay? And basically, another assumption is that there's no basic conflict in society. Don't forget, within these assumptions, the neoclassical model has a rationale within the assumptions. If the assumptions don't hold, that's a different issue. So, internally, the neoclassical model is quite consistent by the assumptions. And the assumptions are, don't forget that you have the individual, there are no group problems, there's no conflict in society. So what is the role of the state then in this?
Make sure it stays. Leave markets alone.
Not that you should leave the markets alone, but you must ensure that you have a free market functioning. Try as much as possible to promote the free market. Okay, so the state has a role to play, but it is to make sure that the free market functions. Because why? The reason is that with a free market, then you will have the most efficient kind of production. Demand and supply will match each other, and the economy will move forward, and you will have the maximization of utility, wealth. As long as the assumptions hold. Keep in mind that if the assumptions don't hold, it's somewhat different. Any questions on this? Because I'll be coming back to this. Yes, I'll be coming back to this in more detail when I look at the market-oriented reforms. Because remember, this is on the market. Promote the free market. Yes?
In the graph you presented, the historical development of economic change, you stopped at the 19th century. And I'm wondering what's happening in the 20th and the 21st century.
Well, it's more or less, the last part is, no. This part, the last... I'm focusing on what is now. I just gave you the sweep to give you the idea it's situated, but what I'm doing now is broken down. Keynes was actually in the 20th century, and many of the others were also in the 20th century. But I'll come to these three groups now. Yes. So you had a question?
Would the role of the state also be to prevent colluding and increasing the prices?
Yes. It should be to prevent monopolies, in theory, yeah. Because anything that could distort prices should be stopped.
The neoclassical is so beautifully put together and so well intertwined.
Yeah.
Why are we not exercising it?
Meaning, why are you, I don't understand the question.
Is our economy based on the neoclassical principles?
The economy is now pursuing a policy which is based on the principles of the neoclassical model. Yeah.
It's based on the principles, but it is not quite pursuing.
No, because the economy is, when the economy is not, how do you say, the assumptions of the neoclassical model don't hold in the real economy. Is that? But you are pursuing, I mean, of course it is a nice model. It's a very persuasive thing, isn't it also? Oh, everybody coming and exchanging goods and services, production is most efficient, demand and supply match, and so on and so forth. I will go into how these are now being pursued further in today's world. But I want you to get the answer, the issue clear. Is that all right? Let me go into the other two schools quickly. I'll do what I can, and then I have to stop. In a way, let me start off with the Marxists, since you are more familiar with it. Marx was analyzing the capitalist mode of production. of production. Again, I'm going to use the terminology that he used. Just like with the neoclassicals, I'm using their terminology, I'm using that. Now, what is a mode of production? A mode of production constitutes, or the characteristics are defined by a particular relationship between the relations of production and what they call the productive forces. Marx was analyzing one particular mode of production, which is the capitalist mode of production he did analyze, by the way, the feudal mode and other modes, but I'm saying in his work, The Capital, the 3 volumes, he basically was looking at the capitalist mode of production, analyzing what were taking place. Now, the capitalist mode of production is identified or characterized by a couple of features. First of all, in terms of the relations of production and the productive forces, how was it characterized? Now, in order to understand, again, a little history and a little story, prior to the capitalist mode existed the feudal mode of production. Feudalism, in a way, the relationship between the productive forces and the relations of production were such that the landlord, in the most simplistic case, landlord owned land, he rented it to the serf, who gave back a part of the product for the use of the land and the product. Okay, so the surplus product was extracted by the landlord. That was, in a way, the core element of the relationship. That was feudalism, where there was a direct extraction of the surplus product by the landlord. With the development of industrialization in England and in France and other places in that region, what you had was that they needed more wool for the industry, for the industrialization process. And prior to that period, the sheep had been grazing everywhere in the countryside. But with the development of the Industrial Revolution, there came about what they call an enclosure movement. An enclosure movement is a process by which certain lands were enclosed and for keeping the sheep and for doing so prior to that, don't forget, the people, the peasantry, had been used to using all of the land. But with the enclosure movement, you had a process by which the peasant was separated from his means of production, his or her means of production, let's say his means of production, which was the land. And the peasant had, therefore, nothing else to sell but had to sell his capacity to work. Because now the land was taken away. There was the enclosure movement. This enclosure movement and the process by which these people had nothing else to do but actually sell their capacity to work is often called, I shouldn't say often called, it's called by Marx as a so-called primitive accumulation of capital. Don't forget that. Can you understand the story? So you had the large amount of peasantry who were dispossessed from their production, basis of production, and at the same time you had a process of industrialization taking place, which also demanded labor. So what really took place under capitalism were 2 groups emerged. One were the capitalists who owned the means of production, because they did own. And then you had the capitalists, the bourgeoisie, I don't know whichever word you want to use. And then you had the workers, the proletariat. So, in the essence of the term, capitalism was characterized by the existence of two main groups in society. One, the capitalists who owned the means of production, and another group who had been dispossessed, the workers, the proletariat, who had been dispossessed from their means of production and who had nothing else to sell but their labor power. Now, Sue, I've run out of time. What do I do? 10 o'clock is, I think, your... Oh, 10:30. Oh. Does anybody want a break?
No.
It's like a suspense story at least. So you had the capitalist motive. Okay, you had the capitalist and the proletariat. Clear? Now, remember, I just want you to go into a few definitions. Do you recall that this line came from the Adam Smith's notion that the value of a commodity, labor was the only source of value? Huh? So the value of any commodity, let me use the term, when I use the term commodity, it's very specific. It is a good that is made for the market. So if I grow potatoes in my garden for myself to eat, I use the term, at least Marx used the term, a good. And if I produce potatoes to sell on the market, it's a commodity. Okay? Now, under capitalism, you have what they call generalized commodity production. I simply mean by that generally production was made for the market. Okay? Now the value of a commodity is the amount of labor time gone into producing the commodity. Is that clear? Good. Now, I told you that the worker had nothing else to sell but his capacity to work. This capacity to work is referred to as labor power. Labor power is not the same as labor. Labor power is a commodity which you sell like any other commodity. What is labor power? The labor power is the value of the worker's capacity to work. But labor power is a particular commodity, very specific commodity, which has the capacity to produce more than its own value in the process of production. Let me explain this by using an example, and don't take it too literally, but just to give you an idea. Let's say I'm a very skilled computer specialist, okay? I sell my labor power, that is, I sell my capacity to work to a firm, to Microsoft, and Microsoft says, I give you $10,000 per day. But in the course of my work, I produce, say, 50,000 in terms of value. 10,000 has gone to pay my wages, right? And there's 40,000 remaining. Because of the particular relationship that exists in capitalism, where the capitalists own the means of production, the extra surplus that is generated therefore accrues to the capitalist. is that, any questions on this? Labor power, therefore, the capacity to work is sold. Is sold to a person who can buy it. It's sold to a person who owns the means of production and puts me to work on that production. Labor power in the process of production creates more than its own value. And the extra value that it produces accrues to the capitalist because that is the way capitalism is. Alright? This extra surplus, either surplus labor or surplus value, therefore accrues to the capitalist. Any questions on this? Any terminology that I should redo, repeat, or do you know it? Yes, sir.
Just on the value of a commodity, we're saying that that is the amount of labor time going into producing. Wouldn't a commodity have other costs apart from the labor time?
Do you remember? I want you to recall what we had earlier gone from the physiocrats. Huh? There's one group of people who took by that everything could be then split into labor time. And we are following that group. Yeah? There will be another group, the neoclassical group, as you can see, has got more. Right? Land, labor, other things, which I will also come to. But within this, labor is the single and only source of value. And the commodity value is measured in terms of labor time. Any other questions on what is the difference between labor power and labor? Let me ask you that. What is the difference between labor power and labor? Crucial difference.
Labor power is a commodity.
Yes.
This labor is what you do in activity.
Yeah, in fact, that you're right. Labor power is a commodity, the value of which is the amount of labor time gone into production, which is measured in terms of wages. Okay? It's put into power, you work longer than your value of your labor time. Okay, so let's take this idea a little bit further. And what you see is that Marx talks, therefore, about the fact that you have surplus labor which is accruing to the capitalist. And therefore, he talks about the contradictions and the crisis of capitalism, which I'm not going to go into now. All right? But I simply want to look a little bit more at the politics of the implications of such an analysis. You have a situation where, therefore, in time, production is becoming more and more social. In other words, more and more people are getting involved in the process of production. At the same time, the appropriation of the surplus is getting more and more into more narrow hands. Can you see that? Because the capitalists are accruing the surplus. Of course, the capitalists are reinvesting, but this is going on. So, one of the political messages under capitalism was, therefore, appropriation should also be according to social need. In other words, because production is social, because everybody is participating in capitalism in the production process, therefore, the appropriation of the surplus should also be distributed not equally, but according to social need. So if you have the handicapped and the sick and whatever, you have to distribute it according to social need. And the state, in the short term, should play a role, naturally, in this process, but eventually under communism, the state will no longer exist. But yes?
How are you defining social need in that?
Well, to be honest, he didn't either define it, but if you can understand that there's an amount of surplus which is generated, okay? You can decide, or the state can decide that, okay, or the individual, in this case, capitalists can decide, I want 3 houses instead of 2 houses. That's an option because the surplus belongs to him, because under capitalism that is the case. Okay, he is the owner. Or the state can take a role and say, listen, this surplus doesn't belong to you should be distributed according to people who are ill, poor, God knows who need it, according to social need. So that was one of the contradictions in capitalism, that you had production becoming more social, but appropriation was still remaining private, and it created this difference. Clear? So do you get the social message? I mean, sorry, political message. Therefore, you have to move to a situation where capitalism has to end, and the state has to take a role in distributing the private appropriation according to social need. Remember, the message of the neoclassical model was make sure that the state moves towards the free market.
Yeah.
Okay? The political message of the role of the state under this analysis, at least in the short term, was the state, therefore get rid of the capitalists, let appropriation also be distributed according to common or social needs. Okay, I'm giving the essence of the argument. Any questions, Sue? You're looking puzzled? Yeah? Yes, sir.
Does this assume that the state was comprised, there are no capitalists in the state?
Yes. In this ideal model, yes, it'll be a socialist state. In this model, don't forget, please look at all the assumptions within which I am talking now. Okay. Now let's get on to the third one to confuse you sufficiently. And the third group is, I've used the term Keynesian because Keynes was one of the earliest people who talked about it, and also I can put it a little bit historically, like a story, because I'm sure by this time you might be ready to give up the ghost. But Keynes was an economist in the 1930s. Now, they brought about another kind of a thinking, which is also highly influential in the way development policies, state policies are now being run. Sorry, I'm turning my back to you. I apologize. Because those ladies insist on sitting in the corner there, and I'm trying to okay. All right. How can I put it best to you? How many of you know Keynes? All right. Now, Keynes was an English economist, and I can best perhaps explain this to you by looking at it historically. 1930s, there was a so-called depression. No, I shouldn't say so-called. There was a depression called the Great Depression, in fact, okay, in Britain, and they were trying to find a way of dealing with it. And this is one of the solutions put forward by Keynes. And let me go into that a little bit more in detail. I'm removing this. You know, okay, what were the characteristics of the Great Depression? There were two main characteristics. One was unemployment, and the other was underutilization of capacity. Unemployment, you all know what it is. You don't have a job, you're looking for your job. Okay? So lots of people were in that situation. Underutilization of capacity simply means that you have 10 machines in a factory and you're using only 2 because, that was it. And you have many which are machines and factories which are idle, not being used, production is not being done. So these were the two characteristics. And there were several economists who tried to figure out what to do. Some people said increase the savings of the capitalists, the investors, and they will maybe do something. It was going on. And there were two economists, actually, Kalecki and Keynes. And Kalecki was actually less known, but came a few months earlier than Keynes, who came up with a kind of a solution. And now I'm going to do the solution for you, but again, you have to follow it without any algebra. I'm just going to talk. So they came up with the idea that the state has to play a role. Now, before I go into what Keynes actually said, I want you to recognize that this group of people accepted the fact that labor was the single source of value. They came followed that line. But unlike the Marxists who said that capitalism will doom and die, I shouldn't say that term, no? Doom and die, I mean split up and eventually break up, crisis, etc. The Keynesian said, no, capitalism will have crises, but we can manage them. We can somehow, the state can come in and manage them. Okay, let's see what Keynes did, and Kalecki. They said, look, the state comes in and makes an investment. It decides that 5 bridges have to be built. Okay, what does it do? It simply prints money, which is called deficit financing, prints money, and says, okay, now we're going to use this money to build these 5 bridges. So first they have to employ 100 people to build the bridge. So at that first level, you have 100 people who have got salaries. Now these 100 people, because they have salaries, they also generate a certain demand for some consumption goods. Okay? So there's an increase of demand in the consumption goods sector. At the same time, you're using some more capacity in the capital goods sector in order to build the bridge, because you need machines to build the bridge. Right? Now, because there's a demand in the consumption goods sector, you have more people working in the consumption goods sector. More machines being used in the consumption goods sector. So, unemployment is decreasing there. And at each step you have what they call a multiplier effect taking place. At each step you have a decrease of unemployment together with increased capacity utilization in the capital goods sector. Okay, let me is this clear? Yes, sir.
Can you please repeat the printing money part?
Okay. The government, see, it's a state of depression. So the government has to take the initiative to deal with it. That is the idea. The government doesn't have money, okay? So what does it do? It does what they call deficit financing. By the way, this is done every year, everywhere, okay? By deficit financing, I simply mean print money and use it for its needs. In this case, the government decides to invest in something. Let's say like building bridges. At the first step of this process, you are employing people. These people are having wages. These wages therefore generate a demand for more consumption goods, which means you are increasing employment in the consumption goods sector as well as increasing capacity utilization in the consumption goods sector. Which means by doing so you are increasing employment and so on and so forth. So at the same, you see that there is a multiplier effect that takes place because of government coming in and intervening and taking an investment. So that each step of the process, unemployment is being decreased as well as greater capacity is being utilized in the capital goods sector. Okay? Now, they said you will do this, you will do this, you will do this, and in this way you will get out of the depression. Any questions on this process? You know, you can make small calculations with this, but we will not do it as long as the sense is clear. The idea is that the state comes in and does this. But what happens now? You have full capacity utilization and full employment. And then you have an increase of demand. What happens? So everybody is employed, hypothetically, all your capacity is fully utilized, and still you have an increase in demand. What happens? No, your full capacity utilization. All your capacity is full. Yes? You need to. No, actually, within the economy, they said you will have inflation, because you have only limited number of goods and more people wanting it. So basically, the idea is that this sort of a solution is short-term. It's a short-term solution to jerk the system out of a crisis. It is not a long-term solution. Somebody asked Keynes, so what's going to happen in the long term? And his reply was, in the long term, you're all dead. I think I'm joking. Keynes made a lot of money. He was in Cambridge. I've studied there, and we had these T-shirts. I don't think I had one, but anyway, in the long term, we're all dead. He really said it's a short-term solution. In the long term, we're all dead. So keep in mind that these corrective exercises also have their limitations. Yes?
Doesn't that mean that if you use a solution like this, you're in a state of perpetual pre-depression? Because as soon as you stop these interventive measures, your market crashes. Because basically
no, your market will, no.
But it's working because you're borrowing from the future. You're borrowing on what you're hoping to produce in the future, the capital that's going to materialize in the future, because it's a deficit model.
But the deficit model is what is normal.
Yes, but if we look at the current system, it is normal, but it's not a functional model. Basically what it does is it sucks resource from other places to sustain an economy. So
there's no problem. There's no problem with deficit financing as long as that money is reflected in terms of production. If because of your deficit, because you print money, you generate enough wealth that is equivalent to the amount of money you printed, then it's perfectly okay. The problem becomes when the deficit financing goes excess of what you have produced. Then you're generating a problem. Yeah?
Is that what inflation is? I don't really understand this.
No, that is not inflation. No, I'll come to inflation later. That is not inflation. Yeah. When prices go up, because, there is limited amount of production and people demand more, then your prices go up. That is a little bit like this mechanism here. Okay, but in Keynes's theory, all he was saying was to get the system out of a crisis. He was not giving any long-term solution. But they accepted the fact that in a capitalist system, you would have crisis. Why would you have crisis? From the Keynesians and the neo-Keynesians, the crisis essentially came because of the fact that production was in private hands and didn't really take into account the social needs. So you would have people who would go in this way and that way, and who would not therefore take care of the rest of the economy. For example, I as a private capitalist, I want to go into computer technology, because I see that's a major thing there, but I might be generating unemployment. So there are bound to be problems in the capitalist system, but the state can come in through measures, through welfare measures, through corrective measures to make the system carry on. It is a constant state of crisis, if you want to use that term, but it is manageable. Okay? Unlike the Marxists who said, no, it will break up and go. So the message here of the Keynesians or the Kalatskians, whichever you want to call it, there are lots of social democrat, whatever it is, that, hey, capitalism does give rise to crisis, but the state can play a role. It can provide welfare needs. It can provide corrective mechanism. It can steer the system to ensure that it gets back on the capitalist path. Okay? So the message, political message in this, in a sense, is the state. The state has an important role as a corrective guider of the whole process. Yes?
The assumption is the state is effective and fully functioning and the state is not.
The state is, of course, the state is not what?
Overrun by because larger multinationals than states today.
Oh, of course. These are all, yeah. It is not making any more assumptions than saying that it has the potential to correct and carry on maybe to the next crisis. Yes.
I think with all the models, for me the profound thing is that these mechanisms, these corrective mechanisms, serve to maintain the economic model. They don't really address the social needs of the people who are in the labour system or out of the labour system. So, as you said, it's a corrective measure to maintain capitalism, but that doesn't mean or point to the fact that capitalism is a functional system to meet public needs, to meet civic need.
You're right, maybe. But that's not the essence of the arguments here. We are analysing capitalism from different ways of looking at how the processes can be dealt with. And, of course, the socialist model does take into account, right, if you look at the Marxist model, it does take into account that, distribution should be according to social need. So it does take into account people who are in a more disadvantaged position. And this reserve army of labour is also a concept which we mentioned several times, which Marx also talks about as necessary in order to prevent the wages of workers from rising up too much. Because if you rise up too much, you can always call on this reserve army of labour to come and replace. So clearly, all I want to say at this point, and I think I have to wind up now, is a few. If you will look at your second map, is that second one? Yeah. Please just, for 2 minutes, look with your neighbor and see if you'll be able to understand some of the key elements in that map. Just with your neighbor, person sitting next to you.
Excuse me. I just have a question about the deficit financing, because I know we currently have a very, in South Africa, we have a strong crisis in terms of unemployment and actually utilization of capital.
If you don't mind, I will deal with that when I come to the current market returns.
Oh, okay.
Which is going to be, I think, at 2.
Oh, in the afternoon.
I go into that in
but I wanted to understand what you meant by, for instance, in terms of deficit financing.
The term is just, it's a term.
Yes.
Deficit financing is simply printing of money by the state.
Okay. Irrespective of what is the value it has. So
the idea is the government needs to spend. Okay.
Yes.
If it doesn't have money to spend, so it prints money. And the hope is that this money will be reflected in some way in the production.
In the production, in terms of value, in the production. And then how do we, then you say that there's an increase in demand. If the system works well, there will be an increase in demand.
Effective demand, yeah.
In effective demand. But when there's an increase in demand, what happens to supply? Then there's also an increase.
That's why I said in the short term you have a multiplier effect where it comes out. In the long term you have a problem of inflation.
Rachel,
yeah.
Where in this is classified the workers are like I think it is criticized when you Amartya said he's an economist, he's also criticizing these guys. So he's apparently somewhere here. But I thought these ones are these ones not the ones that are for Labour Plus?
Yeah, these are more towards
Labour Plus.
They've got Labour Plus other things, especially, yeah. And then these are free market.
Free market. That's what I'm saying, and I didn't want to come on breaking on this one.
You know that now I'm going back to the previous I'm going to miss the next session, the after lunch, after tea session. And this one too.
The one on Thursday.
We've got a meeting with the lady from.
Oh, enjoy the meeting. Yeah, you can have this because I have my food.
Oh, you now have yours?
Yes.
Okay, let me just call. Excuse me. A last thing I need to do. And if you have any questions, I'm here in the break. You can check with me on clarifications. But I just want to end on a few notes. First of all, you must please take into account that I've exposed you to at least 3 main schools. Okay? I'm not saying one is correct and the other is not correct. It's up to you. You have to look at the different schools have differences in terms of the core propositions on what is economic reality. Yes?
Sorry, Rachel, can I just interrupt? I think it's more than just what's up to us. It's a case of being able to read the literature and identify the kind of model, the thinking, the proposition, the assumptions, the ideologies underpinning the authors. Yeah. I think that's where it's particularly useful.
Yeah,
We don't read anything about economics and assume that we're coming to it with the same proposition.
Yeah, well, that's a little bit what I want to say, that, you have differences in the principles evaluation. You saw that? You have differences in terms of priorities of human activity. So one should do this and the other should do this. You have differences in understanding the present society as well as the future directions of society. Okay? Depending on which kind of paradigm you are choosing. And what is also important is that these different schools, to some extent, reflect different interest groups. So, I want to say that ultimately, there are political choices, which is a little bit what Sue is also referring to. There are political choices involved when you take a decision, or whether you prefer one or the other economic theorization in terms of value and distribution. So, the message which I started in the beginning was, hey, this is not an objective science. Huh? The choices you make in terms of economic schools also reflect a certain political choice. They reflect a certain understanding and a certain commitment to the kind of society you want it to be. So when people try and tell you that this is a science, you say it's not a science. Okay? And my one last message is, and I think I should say that, I thought I would just mention what is the gender bias. This came because I was talking to, I think you, at breakfast. Just one small thing. All the 3 schools focus on the market, right? Now, there's a lot of activity which doesn't go into the market, isn't it? But still is production, right? But by the very way in which value is defined, as the value of a commodities, the amount of labor time gone into its production, those activities are not viewed as activities of production with value. Okay? Now there have been many of these activities are done, let me say, by women. Because they are housewives, the gender division of labor, etc. So a lot of these activities are simply not, they're also counted by men. Don't do it and they're not counted, but by and large it's by women. There has been a kind of calculations made by shadow pricings, and it's quite a sizable amount. Out of the 16 trillion of non-valued work, 11 trillion is done by women. Now, what does that mean, actually? You can say, it doesn't really matter. But there are a lot of things that you get because you intervene in the market. Okay? You get your pensions because you've got a wage. You have sickness benefits because you've got a job. Otherwise, you're dependent on somebody in the house. Now, this value, which is generated, has, there have been many revisions of what we call the United Nations System of National Accounts. That's what it's based on. And in spite of those many revisions, which have included now environment and a few other things, as satellite accounts, the services that are done within the household are still not counted as work with value. So if you look at the GNP, which all of you are familiar with, what is the GNP? The GNP represents the wealth of your country. It is the value of all goods and services produced in the country. That does not include the work, services done within the household. Okay? I think I told you the joke. Therefore, we had the economist called Pigou, who said that when a man marries his housekeeper, the GNP of the country goes down. Do you follow? Because there's no longer a transaction taking place. So it just shows the ridiculousness of the whole concept, by the way. Last question. I want to, again, I'm indebted to Liz for bringing this up. Don't forget all these different types of paradigms are also production of knowledge. Production knowledge is also making a claim for power. This is better, this is good, this is power. And as she also pointed out, what does it mean for what is, let's say, I've given you all this, which is purely Western economics, as if many of our developing countries didn't have any economy before this existed. But these are the dominant ways of thinking. And these dominant ways of thinking are influencing us, whether we like it or not. So it's also important to recognize that this claim for power, this knowledge-making, producing, has also got certain biases. Biases which are being maybe propagated by me, because I'm sitting here and giving them to you. But I just want to bring this to your attention, and as she said, also keep into account what is being left out of this agenda. In many ways, what is happening, what is the reality of Africa, what is the reality of many of these developing countries are simply not taken into account because that's not taken into account. It's a power issue. So I've taken a little bit of your tea time. I've given you coverage. Thank you very much for your patience and your efforts.